We're down here at Carriageworks in the Arts Precinct of Sydney to talk to business leader Sam Mostyn. Sam is a board member of the Sydney Swans, a non-executive director of Mirvac and the chair of Citibank Australia, just to name a few. We're here talking to Sam about excellence in governance. Sam Mostyn, welcome to 1+1.
Thank you, Kurt. It's lovely to be here.
You're an accomplished non-executive director, a board member. You chair a bank. You've had a long career in governance. What does success mean for you now?
I think I've reached an age, Kurt, where success has changed, and I'm a mother of a 20-year-old. I've lived through lots of incredible opportunities in my own life, and as I hit my mid-50s, success for me now is making a long-term contribution as someone who has had extraordinary opportunity and now has the opportunity to give, not just give back, but be part of the kind of change I think our community needs, particularly as we keep travelling through the COVID experience.
So you do think that with the effect of the coronavirus on community, that we as a whole will see success as something different?
I think we're all going through a period of deep reflection, whether it's because we're in isolation or we're rethinking our priorities and really not doing all the non-essentials and really focusing on what matters. So we're focusing on the health of the people around us, our loved ones. We're thinking about, I hope, the fact that this terrible virus really exacerbates the existing inequalities that we've seen in our communities for a long time. Suddenly those cracks have opened up and are very deep. You know, the things that felt successful before somehow feel somewhat, they don't feel important enough anymore. Too material, too self-interested, and not enough about what does strength of community really mean as we live through a period that isn't just defined by COVID, but is going to be further stretched and tested by things like climate change, by how we provide a future for our young people into a very uncertain world, a geopolitical environment that is none of us really understand at the moment. So all those things for me combine for people like me to think more deeply about what really matters now, and that success in that environment is very different to what it was before COVID.
What do you think is a good leadership trait to have right now?
Well, I think all of us who are privileged to be in positions where we've had any form of leadership have had to think about reconstructing what it means to be a leader. So Sue Lloyd-Hurwitz, the Chief Executive of Mirvac, where I'm on the board, at the beginning of this pandemic said to the board what she had come to understand was that in periods like this, character is not made, but character is revealed. And that stuck with me right the way through the period, that what we see are the revelations of people's character through this period. And so I think we're seeing new leaders emerge, those whose character and belief in a society and community is driving them to do things that's helping us understand what a post-pandemic life might feel like. I think we're seeing some leaders, and this is globally, who don't know what to do in a state of confusion and complexity and are not resilient and resort to the kind of language that doesn't encourage communities but actually frightens or causes people to have deeper concerns about what lies ahead. So I hope that what emerges is a form of leadership that's compassionate, that's totally transparent, that is engaging with the community and does try to employ a lot of empathy. The idea that we've got to start walking in the shoes of those who are most affected by this period of crisis, I think, will determine where we see great leadership revealed. And I'm not sure we're doing enough of that real walking in the shoes of those who are most affected by COVID.
We're in this room right now. We're in Carriageworks.
Yes.
It's beautiful. What does this room, what does this setting mean to you?
Well, this is a very emotional place for me to be, Kurt. So thank you for meeting me here. Up until late last year, I was chair of the board here at Carriageworks, and this place for me represents the heart of excellence in the arts community and in the community in which it's nested. And it is just this week, coming out of voluntary administration, the whole business model of Carriageworks fell apart at the beginning of COVID because of the cancellation of arts events, anything to do with people coming together to listen to music, to look at art, or even to shop at the farmers market here. So to come through voluntary administration during this pandemic and come out renewed, ready for what it will mean to be an arts organisation operating at its absolute best, still putting arts and artists at the centre, and the excellence that we can learn from artists at the centre of everything that happens here is an inspiring story.
Is there a way that we can disaster-proof venues or organisations like this, that they will be stronger on the other side?
Well, I think the period of voluntary administration that Carriageworks has had has meant that a group of people who ultimately wanted this organisation to rise again had to think very deeply about what were the conditions under which it could rise when the future is so uncertain in terms of how many more lockdowns. Will we ever come together in groups of thousands of people to jump up and down in front of a stage, and what will that look like? And so the thought that's going on here from the board, now led by Cass O'Connor and the team behind her, the work they've put in, they've built resilience into that model. They've retained the commitment to this being community first, arts practice and artists first, but they've built a series of protective measures around this with some wonderful philanthropists who've come on board to say, we will back this enterprise. We'll put our money and our conviction behind this in recovery. The government's come along to say, in light of that, we'll give you a longer licence, so we'll give you more certainty. So some of the things that were uncertain before COVID became the focus of the reconstruction and the rise of the precinct.
Throughout your career, you've played a lot of roles around diversity. Why do you think diversity and inclusion is important?
If people don't feel like they belong, then they feel like they're on the outer. And the work I've done or tried to do over the course of my career, call it diversity and inclusion, has been more about how do we bring a deeper sense of belonging, that people who bring all sorts of forms of diversity and different backgrounds, different life experiences, get to participate around the tables where decisions are made, where they can see their own lives playing out, with something of themselves in those decisions. And I think for far too long we've relied on old senses of leadership teams that have tried to look diverse by adding a little bit of whether it's gender or youth. But I think real diversity, real inclusion is about embracing those that need to be at the table to make decisions that affect their lives, and showing a little bit of humility as leaders who've held those positions, of stepping aside and allowing those that have got new truths to share with us to help us be better leaders and better leadership groups. So
is that the key? So you don't know how many diversity and inclusion days I've been brought in from the outside into an organisation, and I'm the only person with the disability in the room. How do we make sure that those efforts are more than just a tokenistic gesture? You've got to be purposeful about your decision to be inclusive and to ensure that people do feel that they belong. And to be purposeful, you've got to stride out and actually say, what is wrong with this environment? Who's missing? And we have to actually have those people in our organisation around our tables, not because it meets some kind of diversity quota, but because it makes the place, the entity better, it makes decision-making much, much better, and it forces us all to actually put our own interest to one side, to listen to the experiences of others. That's got to be better decision-making at the end of the day, and builds much better cultures. I feel like we misunderstand or just we haven't, as a community, haven't got our head around where disability should fit, and don't feel comfortable having that conversation because we feel uncomfortable. So I think that's one of the biggest areas that we are able to make ground on, is the employment, promotion, and build the capacity of people with disabilities. So my younger sister has an intellectual disability, and she's now in her 40s, and she was placed in a role in Canberra in the ACT Revenue Office when she was 18, and she just celebrated 30 years in that role. And that job and that set of relationships she has with that community of co-workers and the community around her almost defines a big part of her life, and the impact that's had on all of the people she's worked with over 30 years. Well, there's so much in that experience. As the one person who has worked there for 30 years, who, when you see the stats, disability, we take less time off, we contribute to a better sense of environment within the workplace. All the stats, more committed, all the stats say that you should have disability represented in that workforce. But you need somebody to actually hire a person with a disability.
And that's what I think is, you've got to be purposeful about this.
You do.
It's been the same with gender. I think it'll be the same with cultural diversity. I think we're living through a period where that will be the same with Indigenous people actually being welcomed into the halls of power, whether that's around board tables or in politics or in community. And I think we've got to be much more purposeful about that and tell a story about the why that says we're all better for it. It's not to meet some target or to be politically correct. It actually makes us a better society.
You're a board member of the Sydney Swans. I have to go sport, of course.
Of course.
Where does that passion for sport come from?
Well, like most kids of my generation, sport was the thing that got me through my early years. I swam, I played netball, I played basketball, I played tennis. I ended up rowing at university. And so it's always been important to me. And I guess as one of 4 girls, I became quite attached to my dad's love of Aussie rules. And I just have these very fond memories as a young girl sitting with my dad watching the footy. He was a St Kilda tragic, so I became a St Kilda tragic at the time, and it was part of our relationship. It was part of just spending time with him, and I just loved that game, of watching it. And I look now and think, how amazing would it have been, how incredible if I could have played Aussie rules as a woman, as a girl. And of course, it was an option if you were living in Melbourne or Perth particularly, but you had to be around for a while, and then you had to deal with the fact that once you got to a certain age, there was no pathway for you as a girl. That was just for the boys. And so I guess my sport continued as I grew up through some very lucky breaks to be invited into the governance of Australian rules football in the 2000s. And that reinforced my sense of where sport plays a role in all of our lives and how it sits very comfortably with everything else I love, that it's not a binary decision of arts or sport or business or community. It's all these things, and for me, sport is really one of those things I spend a lot of time thinking about from a belonging point of view.
You did get offered a role as a Commissioner of the AFL, the first woman to take on that role.
Yes.
The AFL has appointed its first female Commissioner. Samantha Mostyn, a former advisor to former Prime Minister Paul Keating, will take on the role.
I can tell you it's anything other than tokenism, and I've not done anything in my life that could smack of tokenism. I'm intending to make a valuable contribution to the team.
How imposing is it to be the first woman to enter into a room like that?
It's a great question, because it confronts many women and many people who are not traditionally in those rooms when they first approach. You do feel that sense of history and the enormity of what you're carrying, because you don't want to mess it up, but nor do you want to lose yourself in that process, but you know it's important. And I think the story behind that is important to know, because again, it was a purposeful decision of a great leader, Ron Evans, who was the then chair of the Commission. He's now no longer alive, but his legacy is extraordinary. But I will always credit him with leading a quite conservative sport to a position where they would actually actively recruit a woman onto the Commission, and do that in a way that required a whole lot of administrative arrangements to change to make that happen. So they ran a process. It was a very long, detailed process involving 10 women who were sought around the country and interviewed multiple times before a decision was made at the end. And I was very much the lucky last woman standing, and I'm forever grateful for that moment of receiving that call from Ron to welcome me to the Commission. But we had a conversation before I first started, when he congratulated me, and he said, I can't tell you how delighted I am that we've done this and that we will have a woman amongst our commissioners. And he said, is there anything you need from me? It was a wonderful conversation. Back to purposeful change. And I said, the one thing I need, Ron, is there's enormous honour in being the first, but I'll feel a failure if I'm the last or only. So can we come to an agreement early on that this doesn't stop with the one appointment of a woman, that this is the start of the change in the Commission, and that the next few appointments will be more diverse, particularly with more women, and we think about that as a Commission and how important that is for the future of the industry. And he said, I'll give you that guarantee. I don't want you to be the last, and you shouldn't be there just carrying the voice of women. You're there as a Commissioner. And since that time, there's been 4 women appointed over that period, and the first Indigenous woman appointed to the Commission. So change that came because the chairman at the time started that process and then made sure that it didn't end.
You did say it was quite a conservative organisation. Were you warmly received, do you think, in those first couple of months, not just by the board, but by the AFL community?
So I was very warmly received by the commissioners and by the AFL itself. It was then led by Andrew Demetriou, and that was a very warm welcome and a genuinely sincere welcome. I think all of the presidents once I was appointed, were happy. It's interesting to note that not all clubs supported the appointment of a woman at that time. There were 16 clubs back then and only 13 supported the appointment of a woman. So there were 3 clubs at that time that I knew didn't mind it happening at some point, but were not happy about this direct appointment of a woman. So I knew I had to win over some clubs to ensure that they saw it as a good appointment. The thing I was most surprised about, Kurt, was I got a lot of hate mail. So this is sort of pre-email and Twitter and social media. I got very carefully written letters that often unsigned, so I couldn't respond to some of them, that warned me that what I was doing was dangerous, that it was would take the AFL into dangerous territory and was the end of footy as we knew it. What would girls know about this? We're soft. What would we bring to it? And they would be watching me, and to ensure that I didn't change the masculinity and the muscular nature of football, and that I was being watched. So there were a number of those. But there was an interesting moment where I went to a few events. I met the women of football, long-term supporters of the game, and at one event in particular, a group of women came up to me and I thought they were going to say, congratulations and what does it feel like? And they actually said, we just want to let you know that we wouldn't do what you've done. I said, what have I done? Well, you've joined the AFL Commission in a process where you weren't compared and contrasted to men. You weren't up against men candidates. And so you'll never know if you're really good enough. This kind of quota appointments does such damage to women. And so you shouldn't be proud. You should just reflect on the fact that, that this is quota at work and we wouldn't do it. And I entered a conversation with them to say, I'm intrigued. How else are we going to get our voices heard and be part of this incredible community of governance of the game when we're so much a part of the game, but we're not there around these tables? And for those women in particular, they hated the idea of the quota. And so I use that as an opportunity now to always talk about the fact that hoping, wishing and praying for change when you're in the minority of an industry and not represented is not going to work. You need a purposeful set of appointments and processes. And if you're that lucky person who's the beneficiary of the quota, which it effectively was, even though it was well tested and well interviewed, if you're the recipient, you then have to handle yourself with a great deal of care about what you're opening up for the rest of the people that you represent. And so you grab that opportunity and thrive in it and commit to doing the best job you can. And so that's how I've always handled that. And I'm a big believer in quotas, a big believer in the need to change things by making these kind of purposeful appointments. And I hope those women at the time who thought it was somehow the wrong thing to do now look back and think, actually, you have to break the back of these things sometimes. And you've just got to get in there and then advocate for great change that is about equality and about everyone being able to be judged against one another.
Yeah, outside of that, outside of the expectation, outside of the carrying the weight of being the first woman in that role, there was also, it was one of the most turbulent times in the sport. You had individual drug use, you had potentially systemic drug use, you had salary cap issues. How do you reflect on that period of time now?
You're right, Kurt. Those years, so I was on the Commission for a decade, and during that decade we had, as you say, systemic issues. We had shocking issues around individuals, whether they were players or administrators. We had the expansion, so we spent over $100 million expanding the game to 2 new clubs in New South Wales and Queensland. We had the building blocks for launching the Women's League. So it was a very busy time and a really, really tough time to be an administrator or a governor of the game. So I learnt during that period that there was a bigger obligation we had about the way we made our decisions, the ethical frameworks in which we made those decisions, the contest of ideas around the table that we had to have internally, and then how we had to sell those messages and explain very big decisions. The Essendon Football Club, probably one of the most divisive things we dealt with, Ben Cousins and what was happening with drugs in sport at the time, even the launch of the 2 new clubs. We had to take that out and ensure that the community of people who love Australian rules football had some sense that we'd made decisions appropriately with the right ethical framework, with the right discussions, and we hadn't done things to favour anyone in particular, and we'd done the hard work as directors or as commissioners. And I think I learnt that takes a lot more, that's a harder set of things to do when you've got to be able to explain all of it to the public almost immediately.
You mentioned about the creation of the AFLW. Do you think that if that was in existence when you were at school, do you think that you would have tried to progress sport from there?
Absolutely. I can't get enough of AFLW. I want to be able to leap, and I want to be able to mark, and I want to be able to kick, and most of all, I want to be able to tackle. And I've never used my body in that way. I'm now too old to do it. I'm told I could play in the seniors or do something. But I watch the ability for those young women to learn what men have always known, which is how you can use your full body in a team sport and have that sense of elation and pride in what you're doing. The sports I played, netball, basketball, tennis, swimming, rowing, just feel quite genteel compared to the rough and tumble of an Aussie rules game. And I would have just loved to have had that chance and be told as a girl that we want you to use your body in that way, and we want you to celebrate your victories as a team and sing this team song, and because that's what I see the women now doing, and from young women now all the way through, and the sense of elation they have of now being welcomed, this sense of belonging in the community of this sport. It just thrills me to see that going on. It's one of the things I'm most proud of.
Was there a moment when you knew that it was going to become a reality?
From the moment I went to my first women's games, I knew we had something that we just had to back in, and I knew the community would love it because of the just the way women play footy. It's thrilling, and the women themselves are the advocates and are the showcases of the game. So I knew it would work. There was a moment though where I knew the men of the game had finally got it, and it was after one of the exhibition games at the MCG between Melbourne and the Western Bulldogs. And we had regular exhibition games to sort of test whether broadcasters were interested, test whether the game could be played on those big grounds. And we had the chairman of the commission, Mike Fitzpatrick, and then the chief executive, Gil McLachlan, watching. And I was usually asked to go down into the rooms afterwards to present the medals as one of the women commissioners. And I said to the guys at the time, I'd like you to come down to the rooms and present the medals. And Mike and Gil both felt it's not a place for us, like change rooms, it's women's change rooms, it could be really awkward. I said, just come down, I just need you to see what I see. And they came down, and Mike came into this room full of football players, all in deep bits of recovery, some in ice baths, some being rubbed down to deal with injuries, some being strapped. And the chairman of the commission comes in, who was a captain of Carlton in its heyday, and they look up and all they want to do is talk footy and get his critique of the game. And Gil walks in and he runs the game, and so Gil, what did you reckon, and what did you think of our formations, and sorry it was low scoring, or whatever the conversation was. It was football. Gender was irrelevant. We were in the heartland of what it means to be a football player. And so they handed over the medals, and I think at that moment both Gil and Mike had this sense, they're just like us. Like, I remember that feeling in the change room. We've got to get on with this.
That a dressing shed's a dressing shed. Passion is passion.
And they saw the raw engagement with the game that I had felt and seen and wished I'd ever had a chance to be part of. But they needed to see it as the men of football, because it was then going to be Gil's decision and Gil's job to take that back to the football community and explain why this was the next most exciting thing that would happen, and why it's so important for the longevity of the game and an industry that's up against lots of competition from other sports, ball sports, where women have been welcomed, like soccer. And so if you're going to compete, suddenly these women that were left out become part of your greatest kit bag of things to say back to the community, we're a sport for all.
Do you think that there's a different leadership style between men and women?
It's a bit of a trope, isn't it, that men and women lead differently, but I think my observation would be there are differences, and what we need to see is more women put in positions of authority and power where we can show why our differences are important, and it doesn't make us better or something have to replace all the men, but we do bring something that often has been missing. And I see that particularly in board discussions, and when you're sitting around a table dealing with very tough issues, it's often a woman that will bring a really tough issue to the table in a way that encourages a conversation. I think that it's not always the case, but I think we bring something to tough decisions about the future, because we have different life experiences. I think we're generous in the way we want to have those conversations, and we're prepared to listen and show empathy, and often bring that personal story forward. Maybe it's because we're encouraged to do that early about how we live our lives. But I think the difference, the great thing about us being different, is get us into those positions of authority and power, get us sitting around those tables with an equal right to lead, and let us have a go.
How do you think politics would look if it was more diverse, if there were more women in Parliament?
Well, I'm a really big supporter of an organisation called Women in Politics, and we have got to get women encouraged to want to be in the political process. I remember at primary school in Canberra going to a visit to Old Parliament House and thinking, I want to be representing a community in the Parliament. I actually thought that at the time as a little girl, and the messages I got as I got older and older were that girls don't do that. It's a place for men. Men have political careers. I went on in a part of my life to be a policy advisor in government, federal government, in the Keating time. So I worked for 2 ministers and then the Prime Minister at the time as a policy advisor. And what I saw around me again repeated was a model that was about men representing their communities. There were very few women. Those that were there were extraordinary. But my observation was that it was a punishing life. It was very masculine, very macho. It wasn't a healthy life. I'd look around at the parliamentarians and think, this isn't where you make good decisions or where you have a good life. And so I left political advising or policy advising to go back into business. I'm not a member of a political party, never have been, but I believe in the power of great government and good policy making. But I don't think it was a place that women really felt excited to go to or to give up what was required to live that life. And so I think the movements that are now on to actually encourage women to stand for office, whether it's at local government, state government, into the federal parliament, we'll see a lot of women doing that and opening up a different way of actually being parliamentarians. I think they'll live full lives. I think they'll be able to manage their families alongside their political jobs. But that just wasn't the world that I grew up in. And I wish my daughter that if she wanted to be involved in politics, that door would be open and she'd be able to deploy herself and have a good life as part of that. But it would be a different parliament. It would sound different. It would feel different. The stories that would be brought into the parliament would be different. The lived experience of families, of communities, we'd see a lot more of that than we do at the moment in a more muscular environment. And I think we get better policy as a result of just more diversity in our parliaments.
When we get to the other side of the coronavirus, when the pandemic is no longer turning everybody's life upside down, what do you think the biggest pressing issues will be?
Kurt, as we face into whatever world awaits us post the pandemic, one thing is certain, we have to think very deeply about what it means to be part of a sustainable world. And sustainability for me is I guess, the overarching challenge that picks up our response to climate change, our response to social inequality, the issues we've discussed about who belongs around the tables of power. So what does new power look like in a world where people really do have a chance to participate in the decisions that affect their lives? How do we deal with the scourges of domestic violence, family violence? And of course, we're living in a time where Black Lives Matter right around the globe is teaching us about what it means to have privilege or not have privilege. And I think that rests very heavily in Australia on our need to be the country we can be if we start with addressing some of the things we haven't wanted to deal with that start with the way in which this country was formed in the early days of the colonies. And the fact that the education that you and I had that didn't tell us about the 60,000-year rich history of Indigenous ownership of the land that was never ceded, but was then taken by the occupiers that came to create the nation we now call Australia. And I think our constitution should reflect that. If we can start with just that point, that we actually understand what it would mean to be a fully evolved Australia, bringing through that 60,000 years of history respectfully, for people like me to put aside some of my white privilege and to listen and cede those opportunities to those that should be helping us understand that, I feel that we can actually handle many more of the other questions that come, because I think we'll be a much more settled country, a happier country, and one that's drawing on the most extraordinary culture that can help us solve sustainability issues.
Sam, there are so many areas that you're excelling in, whether that be sport or diversity or governance, sustainability or business. Just thanks for joining me on 1+1.
It's been an absolute privilege, Kurt. I just love talking to you.